Introduction to the Sixth Commandment. Now let's turn to the Sixth Commandment, which is numbered as the Fifth Commandment, according to some Christian traditions. It says, "You shall not commit adultery," in the Old Testament. It's also one of the commandments that Jesus internalizes in the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 5, he says that if someone lusts after another woman in his heart, he still violates this commandment. One recent president of the United States once famously admitted that he had violated this commandment in his heart. Do you know who it was? My students usually don't get it until the fourth or fifth guess. Jimmy Carter in 1976, in an interview with Playboy magazine, of all things. Now let's turn to what the commandment generally requires and prohibits. As with the other commandments, this one has been interpreted very broadly by Catholics and other Christians to apply not just to adultery, but sexual activity in general. Let's start with some basics before getting into specifics. Chastity. Chastity has been defined by the Catholic moral theologian William Madison as the virtue of using our sexuality well in our thoughts, desires, and deeds. Chastity is a specific virtue that falls under the more fundamental virtue of temperance, since it involves desiring the pleasurable activity of sex in a good or reasonable way. But chastity is also related to the theological virtue of charity or love, since the person who loves his or her neighbor, more specifically his or her spouse, will use his or her sexuality in a better and more self-giving way. Whom does the Church expect to have this virtue? Everyone. Not just priests and nuns. Yes, of course, priests and nuns are expected to be chaste. For them, using their sexuality well means never getting married to other people or having sex, so that they might more fully devote themselves to God and others. But married and single people are also expected to be chaste. For married people, using their sexuality well involves having loving sex with their spouse, while for single people, using their sexuality well means waiting to have sex until marriage, according to Catholic teaching. On this note, many people get chastity confused with celibacy. A vow of celibacy, which priests and nuns take, is a commitment to never marry. Celibacy is just one particular way of living chastely, but not the only way. Next, lust. Lust, one of the 7 deadly vices, can be defined in a couple of different ways. It is considered the unreasonable or excessive desire for sexual pleasure, and as such, it is opposed to temperance. But we might also define it in a way that highlights its difference from chastity, the vice of using our sexuality poorly in our thoughts, desires, and deeds. So it's the polar opposite of chastity, in other words. And according to Catholic teaching, it is always prohibited. Is lust possible even in marriage? Yes, actually. If one spouse treats the other spouse not lovingly, but purely as a sexual object, that's lust. Next, marital fidelity. In its treatment of the Sixth Commandment, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the official compendium of Catholic teaching that was published in the mid-1990s, often uses the word fidelity. The Catechism states that fidelity expresses constancy in keeping one's given word, and goes on to suggest that marital fidelity in particular involves the obligation to preserve the marriage covenant as unique and indissoluble. Is marital fidelity also a virtue? I think so. You could see it as falling under the more general cardinal virtue of justice, since it involves spouses giving to each other what they owe each other, to keep the promises they made to each other at the outset of their marriage. In any case, Catholic teaching requires all married couples to be faithful to each other. Fourth, respect for the unitive and procreative purposes of the sexual act. We now move from general dispositions, such as chastity, lust, and marital fidelity, to particular actions. According to Catholic teaching, the Sixth Commandment requires us to respect the unitive and procreative purposes of the sexual act. In order to respect these purposes, the Catechism suggests, we must follow 2 specific rules. First, freely chosen sexual activity must be fully unitive, in other words, self-giving, and fully procreative, in other words, life-giving. In order for sex to be fully unitive in this understanding, the couple must be permanently and exclusively committed to each other, in other words, through the vows of marriage. In order for sex to be fully procreative, it is not necessary to guarantee that you are going to have children, but only that you are open to the possibility of children, and do nothing directly to make the sexual act infertile or sterile. The second rule is that procreation must not be separated from sexual union. Sometimes my students ask whether God himself violated this rule by impregnating the Virgin Mary. It's an interesting question. One way to try to avoid the problem is to define procreation carefully, so let's do that. The creation of humans by humans through the natural biological means of sperm and egg. The idea then is that God is not bound by this rule. Why should we follow the sixth commandment? Why is it important to cultivate chastity, to avoid lust, to be faithful to one's spouse, and to respect the unitive and procreative purposes of the sexual act, according to Catholic teaching, in order to respect the dignity of the human person? What's that? It's a value or worth that we have that's intrinsic or essential to us, not earned by us or conferred on us by society. It's also connected to the cardinal virtue of justice. In order to be just, we owe it to others to respect their dignity and the rights that flow from that dignity. And why do we have human dignity in turn? The Judeo-Christian rationale is that we are made in the image and likeness of God, as the first chapter of Genesis, verses 26 to 27, makes clear. You could put it in more secular terms. We have dignity because we are able to reason, act freely, and love. When we are chaste, the Church teaches, we protect our own dignity by freeing ourselves from slavery to our passions. And Pope Paul VI's 1968 encyclical Humanae Vitae, that's just Latin for on human life, indicates that when spouses have sex that is both fully unitive and procreative, they respect their own nature and dignity, and that we can see all of this using our reason alone. On the other hand, when we are lustful, we see other people purely as a means to the end of sexual pleasure and treat them as objects, and thereby disrespect their dignity. And when someone is not faithful to their spouse, they violate the dignity of that spouse. Furthermore, according to church teaching, when procreation is separated from sexual union, the child is treated as an object, the result of a laboratory process, and therefore his or her dignity is disrespected. As we've already seen, Catholic thought specifically permits, indeed encourages, marital sex that is fully unitive and procreative. Next, we're going to turn to some other actions the commandment specifically permits and prohibits. Many, but not all of the topics I will cover are explicitly covered by the sections in the Catechism of the Catholic Church and the United States Catholic Catechism for Adults on the Sixth Commandment. But all of the issues we'll be looking at do appear to pertain to the basic principles at the heart of this commandment. Let's turn to what the commandment specifically permits and prohibits. We'll begin by looking at some actions contrary to chastity. First, masturbation. I assume everyone knows what masturbation means. It's defined by the Catechism as the deliberate stimulation of the genital organs in order to derive sexual pleasure. According to the Catechism, this is always morally wrong. Is it consistent with the Church's general requirements or rules we went through above? No. According to Catholic teaching, it is opposed to chastity, and it would violate the first rule I mentioned above. In other words, it is freely chosen sexual activity that is neither fully unitive nor procreative, and so the Church considers it to be always morally wrong. At the same time, the Catechism states that while this act is seriously immoral, certain circumstances, namely immaturity, force of acquired habit, anxiety, or other psychological and social factors can diminish the person's responsibility for it. Next, fornication. The rest of the sexual activities we'll consider here always involve more than one person. Fornication is just another word for premarital sex. It is also considered always morally wrong. It is listed in the Catechism as an offense against chastity, as well as dignity, and it violates that first rule above that we talked about. Once again, we have freely chosen sex that is neither fully unitive nor procreative. Even if the couple is open to having a child, the act is still not considered fully procreative, since an exclusive marriage relationship is seen as the best environment in which to intend to raise such a child. Next, incest. Incest is defined by the Catechism as intimate relations between relatives or in-laws within a degree that prohibits marriage between them. So, this is another form of sex between people who cannot be married. It is also always morally wrong. In fact, the very name incest means not chaste. According to the Catechism, incest corrupts family relationships and marks a regression toward animality, indicating that it violates human dignity as well. Fourth, homosexual acts. In contrast to the sorts of acts described previously, homosexual acts are defined in the Catechism as relations between men or between women who experience an exclusive or predominant sexual attraction toward persons of the same sex. It is also considered always morally impermissible by the Church, and in particular, an offense against chastity and against the first rule I mentioned earlier, because it is freely chosen sexual activity that is neither fully unitive or fully procreative. In the Catechism's words, homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine affective and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved. Moreover, according to Catholic teaching, same-sex marriages should not be recognized by the state. According to the 2003 document, Considerations Regarding Proposals to Give Legal Recognition to Unions Between Homosexual Persons, signed by John Paul II, legal recognition of homosexual unions or placing them on the same level as marriage would mean not only the approval of deviant behavior, with the consequence of making it a model in present-day society, but would also obscure basic values which belong to the common inheritance of humanity. All of this teaching must be given some context, however. The Catechism acknowledges that it is not easy for those with a homosexual inclination to live in accord with Church teaching. One might say that doing so involves the cardinal virtue of fortitude, or facing difficulties well. At the same time, the Catechism says they can achieve chastity through the support of friends, prayer, and the sacraments. We might also mention here support groups such as Courage International. In general, the Church states that homosexuals must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. Shortly after he was elected Pope, Pope Francis remarked that, if someone is gay and he searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? So, in the end, while we need to be clear that the Church does consider homosexual activity a sin, it extends love and compassion to those with same-sex attraction. On that note, you may have heard of Westboro Baptist Church, a church in Topeka, Kansas that protests against funerals, engages in anti-gay picketing, and carries signs that say that God hates gays. I think we can distinguish that hateful attitude from that of Catholic teaching. We'll talk in depth below about arguments for and against same-sex sexual activity, but first let's briefly address some other topics. The fifth topic is prostitution. We move now into sexual activities for an explicitly financial motive. Here, the idea is that the person who engages in prostitution and the person who pays for it both violate chastity and freely engage in sex that is not fully unitive or procreative. Once again, always morally impermissible. But, returning to action theory for a moment, while the object here is always bad, according to Catholic teaching, the Catechism notes that there are circumstances that might increase or diminish a person's moral responsibility for engaging in prostitution. For instance, child prostitution can increase the responsibility for this act. But if the prostitute faces destitution, blackmail, or social pressure, that can diminish responsibility. Sixth, pornography. This is defined in the Catechism as removing real or simulated sexual acts from the intimacy of the partners, in order to display them deliberately to third parties. We still often have financial motives here, but now we have third parties involved. Acting in, selling, or perusing pornography is always morally impermissible in Catholic teaching. These are considered offenses against chastity and the dignity of its participants, and at least in the cases of acting in pornography or using it to engage in masturbation, there's a violation of that first rule we talked about. In other words, there's freely chosen sexual activity that is neither fully unitive nor procreative. Seventh, rape. The previous acts can all be consensual, although, in the cases of prostitution and acting in pornography, they aren't always entirely so, since the people engaging in them often do so out of financial pressure. Rape, on the other hand, by definition, is never consensual, and it's also always morally impermissible, of course. Does rape violate either of our two general rules? Well, no, actually. Note that the first rule technically doesn't come into play here, since we don't have freely chosen sex to begin with. But rape is considered a very serious violation of chastity, and it's also a violation of the virtues of justice and charity. Can homosexual acts ever be morally permissible? A closer look. As we've seen, Catholic teaching answers this in the negative. Now let's take a closer look at arguments for and against. One level the debate takes place on is the philosophical level. In other words, using arguments based on reason alone. As we've already seen, the Church believes that freely chosen sex must be fully unitive and fully procreative. In encyclical Humanae Vitae, Paul VI suggests that our contemporaries are particularly capable of seeing that this teaching is in harmony with human reason. The Catechism further indicates that homosexual acts are neither fully unitive nor fully procreative. More specifically, it says that homosexual acts are contrary to the natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine affective and sexual complementarity. You heard those words, natural law. In the Catholic moral tradition, the natural moral law is present in the heart of each man and established by reason, and is universal in its precepts, and its authority extends to all. Therefore, the Church concludes, homosexual activity is morally wrong, and we can see this using our reason alone. Now, here's an issue that you sometimes hear. The Church does allow elderly and other sterile heterosexual couples to marry. So a common objection to Church teaching is that it's inconsistent in applying the rule above, the argument being that it allows some sterile people to marry, in other words, heterosexuals, but not others, in other words, homosexuals. Therefore, that objection goes, freely chosen sex need not be fully procreative in order to be moral, and in fact, the Church itself recognizes this. But one might respond to this objection by distinguishing between heterosexual sterile sex and homosexual sex. One author, Christopher Wolfe, puts it as follows. Homosexual sex, like contraceptive sex, involves deliberate engagement in a kind of sexual activity that is inherently sterile, whereas heterosexual, sterile sex does not. Therefore, the reasoning goes, heterosexual, sterile sex does not violate the rule that freely chosen sex must be fully unitive and procreative, whereas homosexual sex does. What about the more explicitly religious levels of the debate? Christians, of course, will also be interested in what, if anything, the Bible has to say about these issues. The Catechism firmly maintains that Scripture presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity, and cites a number of passages here, both in the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 19, and New Testament, Romans chapter 1, verses 24 to 27, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 10, and the first letter to Timothy, chapter 1, verse 10. Let's take a look at the Genesis passage. It centers on a man named Lot who lived in a town called Sodom. Lot has two male visitors, who are actually angels, who come to his house to dine. But before they go to bed, the townsmen of Sodom surround Lot's house and demand that he bring the visitors out so that they might have sexual relations with them. The angels then warn Lot that God has sent them to destroy the town, but they permit Lot to leave before the town is obliterated. Now the question here is, why exactly was God mad at Sodom? The traditional Christian response is that God disapproved of their attempt to engage in homosexual activity, among other sins. More liberal Christians often try to explain this passage away by saying that it was actually the inhospitality of the townsfolk in wanting to rape the visitors that God was angry at, not homosexual conduct in general. In response, while it is true that Sodom's sins included pride and inhospitality, as suggested by Ezekiel chapter 16, that biblical chapter also calls Sodom's sin an abomination, using the same Hebrew word that is used in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, which condemns sexual activity between men. Moreover, Sodom clearly had a reputation for sexual sin, as shown by different Jewish sources from the 2nd century BC. Finally, in the New Testament, Jude 7 states that Sodom, along with other surrounding towns, engaged in sexual promiscuity and practiced unnatural vice, which can easily be read as referring to homosexual activity. Referring to each of these sources, Christian pastor Kevin DeYoung concludes in his book that Sodom's sins were many: pride, social injustice, and pursuing homosexual behavior. To take one other example from the New Testament, Paul refers in Romans 1, verses 24 to 27, to the degrading passions of idolaters. Their females exchanged natural relations for unnatural, and the males likewise gave up natural relations with females and burned with lust for one another. Males did shameful things with males and thus received in their own persons the due penalty for their perversity. This is the only passage in the Bible that appears to refer to lesbian sex and not just gay sex. Some people try to explain this passage away by saying that what Paul was really concerned about was people acting against their nature, in other words, heterosexuals having homosexual sex, and that if people had only known 2,000 years ago that some were naturally homosexual, Paul would have been okay with their only having sex with people of the same gender. But the traditional perspective is that this knowledge would not have affected Paul's final position on the matter, and that the meaning of this biblical chapter is clear. Paul condemned same-sex activity as contrary to God's design, period. Finally, when thinking about a particular moral issue, Catholics and many other Christians will be interested in not just what the Bible says, but also tradition. Would you say that 2,000 years of church tradition has more or less approved of same-sex activity, or has it been opposed? The answer is that most theologians and branches of Christianity have been pretty consistently opposed until very recently. St. John Chrysostom and Augustine in the 4th century, St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, and Martin Luther, who helped lead the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, are just a few of many, many examples. Now, of course, opponents of church teaching will claim that this tradition should change, since it is of men, not of God. But Catholics and others hold that God speaks to people through tradition on this issue and others, and that the opposition of tradition to homosexual activity has been so unified and consistent that it could not possibly just be man-made, but is a strong sign of God's will.